In anticipation of the coronation of King Charles, all Premier League football teams playing that week were expected to play the British national anthem before their game. In Liverpool, this was always going to be the cause of some contention, and few were surprised when the Liverpool fans erupted into boos to drown out the sound of the anthem. And although few were surprised, there was a great deal of outrage. Much of the UK took to social media to express their outrage at what they saw as the utter disrespect of the monarchy. Discourse surrounding football is always passionate, but the irreverence of Liverpool fans to the British monarchy caused nationwide outrage. When reading the responses to Liverpool's reputation for anti-establishment sentiments, I got the overwhelming feeling that the history behind this stance is often wildly overlooked. To understand how irreverence towards the British establishment has become an integral part of Scouse culture, you have to understand the history of the establishment's relationship with Liverpool.
This is the life, eh?
Hey! Hey! Do you want to fight or something?
Calm down, eh? We're on a fight break, remember?
To walk around the city centre today, it's hard to imagine the dereliction that's described by the media of the 70s, 80s and 90s. In fact, it's hard to even see a trace. But it is there, and it's in the minds of the people who lived through it. It's difficult to convey just how dire the situation was, but in appreciating the scale of the desperation, it may make it easier to understand the city's sense of isolation from the rest of the country. Liverpool established itself as the second port of the British Empire, and this form of prosperity is reflected in the grand architecture that's preserved in the city centre. Despite the port's economic successes, the city was made up of a large working class, many of whom were dependent on port work. This system worked relatively well until the decline of Liverpool's prevalence among the UK ports in the late 1960s. Despite the port's growing irrelevance, the 1960s appeared to be a heyday for the city, with a small economic boost due to an increase in manufacturing work, and an era that saw Scouse people being framed positively in the public eye. In this decade, Liverpool experiences its Indian summer, with a burst of culture, from music to comedians, and it's here that we see a strong sense of Scouse culture emerge as something to be proud of.
The kind of 1960s Merseybeat thing had the effect of really sweeping away sectarian identities, Protestant and Catholic identities, which were declining anyway, but this was a really powerful way of moving them, in a way that perhaps like in Glasgow, for instance, they haven't been swept aside. And so the 1960s was pivotal for that, for creating a Scouse identity, even if that identity wasn't politically salient at that time. And then when you contrast the kind of economically barren years of the 1980s for the city, plus the fact that the Scouse identity, the Beatles, all that went through, Liverpool went from being somewhere that people really liked and somewhere that people would, if you said you were from Liverpool, you know, they'd buy you a drink or something. In the 1980s, the reverse was true then, and it became seen as a place where everything was wrong.
It's not until the 1970s, when we see a sharp economic decline for the city, that we see Liverpool go against the grain, with the Conservative Party beginning to lose votes. And it's from the 1970s that we see the stereotype of Scouse antagonism begin to take place.
I think in Liverpool, it's long been the case that there's this sense of anti-establishment that first took root in partly a result of the nature of employment in Liverpool. So the docks, people would turn up for the day to see if they could get some work, whereas in other areas, like say big factory towns, which led to working class people voting Conservative in a sense of deference to their bosses, you would get more of a sense of hierarchy there. But because of the nature of dock work, it's much more individualistic, and which meant that people were much more irreverent when it came to social hierarchies. And the Conservative political machine in the city, which was dominant for nearly 100 years, was based around the pub trade, which, as you can imagine, is not a place for high levels of deference, and around Protestantism, which people felt very strongly.
I think it is true to say that there's a culture of opposition in Liverpool, but it's not really consistent. It kind of works in all different directions. So if we take, for example, the late 1990s, when the Labour Party had just won a landslide general election victory, what does Liverpool do? It goes Lib Dem. So it goes in the opposite direction very, very often. It's kind of an odd sense of defiance, of being different. There's a famous quote actually once from a Communist Party organiser in the early 20th century. Who say basically, don't go to Liverpool as a trade union organiser. It's an agitator's or it's an organiser's graveyard. You just can't organise these people. They're too flamboyant, they're too spontaneous, they're too anarchic. So there is something about Liverpool which is a little bit different, but I think within that there's also a sense of, there's a mythology about that. It's become kind of cultural, it's embedded in the way people think about themselves in the city, and it just sort of plays out in all kinds of, I have to say, unpredictable ways.
Around the 1960s, you get a kind of new slew of comedians who kind of played on that working class, irreverent culture, and through that kind of social conditioning, it just became embedded as part of that identity. So the anti-establishment, in a sense, historically was a bit of a myth before the 70s, because actually the Protestant conservative machine was based on respect for the crown, respect for empire, and the ability to alleviate some of the harsh edges of working class life. But it's definitely become more of a self-identifiable label because of that stronger cultural output in the city.
In the 1970s, Liverpool saw its rate of unemployment quadruple from 5% to 20%. And by 1985, it was 26%, double the national average. The general response of the most prominent government figures to the dire financial situation Liverpool faced was one of at best apathy and at worst callousness. However, we do see figures in the Conservative government, such as Michael Heseltine, the designated Minister for Merseyside, who did come to advocate for the city and is recorded to have vehemently opposed the talks of a managed decline. Margaret Thatcher herself said, "Liverpool has defeated better men than Michael Heseltine."
Well, Liverpool did suffer very, very badly from deindustrialisation, economic decline, right through the 1970s and especially in the 1980s. It wasn't the only UK city to go through that. I mean, so did Manchester, so did Sheffield, so did Leeds. It was deeper in Liverpool, that the impact was greater. It really was, and the job loss was just incredible. Half the jobs in the city went between the early 1970s and the mid 1990s. Devastating.
Don't think it's possible to realise how bad it was. I think there was a time when there were 40 jobs for young people. Everybody leaving school was in that situation. It just felt totally hopeless. It felt like the capitalist system was falling apart and there were literally no options for anybody. Liverpool's a city that had no right to be here anymore. Just totally hopeless. It was more than left behind, it was abandoned. It was totally abandoned. I think the government felt that the British economy needs to be fundamentally reorganised. We joined the European Union, so stuff would not be coming into Liverpool, be coming into the docks on the other side of the country. There's containerisation. People then thought Liverpool was a militant city, so they famously said that putting money into Liverpool would be throwing stones on stony ground.
It's worth noting that Liverpool stopped voting Conservative before the beginning of the Thatcher government. But the real beginning of the city's history of anti-establishment tendencies begins with anti-Thatcherism. Anti-Thatcherism becomes anti-conservatism, anti-conservatism becomes anti-government, and anti-government becomes anti-establishment. What do you think of Margaret Thatcher?
I think she was a scourge to the earth, and I'm glad she's dead.
Sold a lot of things that we owned, ruined the country.
Evil. Yeah, we don't like her. Yeah.
Margaret Thatcher, in discussion with MP for Knowsley Robert Kilroy-Silk, said, "The problem with your constituents is that they don't start up their own businesses. They've got no entrepreneurial spirit, no get up and go." Thatcher, in almost all her commentary on Liverpool, gives credence to the idea of a criminal underclass, a group of lower class people that are born work-shy, criminal and uncivilised. This belief discourages systems of welfare and effectively summarises Thatcherite economic policies, the concept that we must all look out for ourselves.
I don't think now there's the same discourse of the Scouser as being lazy and being dependent on the state, because the city has been abandoned. So Scouse people are very entrepreneurial. They've got lots of get up and go. It comes out in good ways with culture and music and comedy. That's why the city centre has revived so much, because Liverpool's got so much to offer. I think only Liverpool could have put on the Eurovision Song Contest the way it did. That's the very best of Liverpool. So I think it's a different kind of pathology. I think it's also very different once you get out of England, really. I don't even think that Welsh people and Scottish people and Irish people have the same prejudicial views, particularly around the rest of the world. Not at all. They think Liverpool's amazing. You know, I went to a bar in Mendoza in Argentina that was the Liverpool bar. You know, frankly, there won't be a Derby bar, you know, or a Leicester bar. It's down to the music and everything like that, but it is down to the characters. I think it's particularly English, perhaps even Southern English prejudice, and I think I can say that because you can tell from my accent that that's where I'm from.
The conflict between the Thatcher-led government and Liverpool continued throughout the 80s, often defined as a Thatcher-Militant dispute, despite the fact that Militant didn't actually have a majority in the Liverpool City Council. The legacy of the Trotskyist militant group is perhaps greater than the contemporary impact they had.
You have the problems of the early 1980s, and the Militant offered young people hope. They said this is a real alternative, and it was full red-blooded socialism. And if you read what they wrote about, it was like East Germany. It was that proper socialism. None of your New Labour stuff or your Starmer stuff. It was full-throated socialism, and I think that made a lot of sense to a lot of people. And then I think it was Hillsborough that really did make people think the rest of England really doesn't think we have any value whatsoever. It's why you still can't buy the Sun here. You know, what's it now? 30 years on. You know, so I think it was the Hillsborough thing, really. I think without Hillsborough, probably the Militant Council would have been forgotten.
It served both the militant-led Labour Council and the Thatcher government to have a massive conflict over how Liverpool City Council was funded because of two completely different worldviews. So for Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative government, they didn't want other local councils to do what Liverpool City Council did, which was set a legal budget, borrow more than they were getting in, or spend more than they were getting in, and have to borrow from banks, from foreign banks. Where Militant wanted to do a new kind of way of doing local politics that required more money than the central government was willing to give them, and that they could raise through the rates. And so it suited both to have this conflict, and the byproduct of that was basically Militant lost in terms of the political side of things, but they won on the kind of propaganda level or the public opinion level, where most people in Liverpool, even Conservative voters, thought the Conservative government gave them a hard time. And so that is where the anti-Conservative sentiment really was turbocharged and really tied into the idea of also being from Liverpool, right? So this idea that instead of it being I'm anti-Conservative and I live in Liverpool, it became I am from Liverpool, therefore I am anti-Conservative, regardless of kind of any of the policies or anything. And then it was massively strengthened by the Hillsborough disaster and the idea that, you know, the correct idea that there was a cover-up amongst the police, and this was all just tied into a broader establishment position, which is completely fair enough. And then the long struggle to kind of get the truth all ties in and kind of reinforces the anti and makes it stronger actually over time, right? It's just like an avalanche, right? It might start small with Militant Thatcher, but over time it picks up momentum, and that's kind of where we are now.
Media presentations of Scousers in the 80s turned particularly sour when discussing the Hillsborough disaster.
The real cause of them, the kind of Scouse identity kind of coming together and seeing the rest of England as the other was the council conflict with the Thatcher government, and then the negative portrayals following the Hillsborough disaster. That was a real sense of actually, you know, there is an establishment out there and they are against us.
Perhaps one of the greatest achievements of Liverpool's community of anti-establishment is the boycotting of the Sun newspaper.
It switched actually from trying to persuade people not to buy it and then they weren't, I mean, nobody was buying it, to trying to persuade shops not to sell it. So you'd find it incredibly hard if you went out now to find a copy of this newspaper anywhere in Liverpool. You'd have to push out quite far into the rest of Merseyside to find one, and then you'd still struggle. It's remarkable. It is, I think, sustained by the sheer anger about the Sun's reporting. I mean, the original Sun headline, I mean, it's so outrageous, I'm not going to repeat it, that were the claims that were made. Everybody knows that. The Sun delayed its apology, then did a kind of half apology. So, I mean, it's a sense of absolute anger which has sustained that.
Liverpool sits in a far better situation today. Despite widespread shock, the bid for capital of culture proved successful and reshapes the city's image both internally and externally. Yet the anti-establishment sentiments that were solidified in the 80s can still be felt in the city today. The rhetoric of Scouse not English is certainly an oversimplification of the history, but it effectively conveys the sense of resentment between Scouse people and the establishment that they do not believe provided for them in their most vulnerable period. It's the political legacy of a city that doesn't feel its government helped to pull it out of desolation. So when Liverpool fans jeer at the national anthem, it's not merely a rejection of the monarchy, it's a dismissal of a nation that they don't feel represented by. Why work for an establishment that doesn't work for you?